Well, thank you for coming this evening. For those of you who don't know, I'm Marty McGinley, the district administrator here at Wheatland. We obviously are in a great space tonight at the library. This has been a couple of years ago, about 4 years ago, when we had our facilities referendum. This was the idea was to create a space for something like this. So we're glad to be able to be using it. Over the course of the last couple of years, it's been a little bit more difficult with the pandemic and not being able to get together, but it's nice to see people here tonight. So the first thing I want to talk about is when you have a referendum or have a conversation about a referendum, the big piece that we're focused on facilitating is the learning here. And so over the course of the last decade or so, Wheatland has worked very hard with some pillars of what we think is important for an educational process. So I just kind of listed some of those up here. And the first talks about skills and aptitude. Obviously, we're in a different learning environment than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And the referendum, or the pandemic process is a really good example of why that is. We were able to respond to that with virtual learning almost immediately, and it worked out. Obviously, it was not the best case scenario, but we were ready for those kind of things. Our students were ready. They're very technologically savvy. They understand project-based learning. So that was a great indication to me that we were having some success. Well, the second is the schools are only good when you have great teachers. So teachers are more important than anything that we do here, and they're the ones that make all this come to life. So a great staff, a great group of teachers is critical to what we do and our success. The other piece is that adaptability. So we have, while we send students to both Central and to Wilmot, there's a lot of other high schools that take students from Wheatland as well. They could go to Lake Geneva or they could go to Burlington. We want them to be ready for whatever high school they go to. So we want them to have accumulated the skills, aptitudes, and dispositions to be successful wherever they go. And we don't have, college and career ready is a ways off for our 8th graders. They graduate from Wheatland and then they move on to high school and start to think about the kinds of things that they'd want to do with their life. Here they get to explore those things. They get to try new, a varied group of different electives, and they get to experience, and kind of figure out what they like and what they want to be when they grow up. So, and then that gets refined through the high school process. And then our engagement in a continuous learning, our continuous improvement process to facilitate that learning is incredibly critical to us getting better every day. And I think that groundwork was set when we had discussions way back about the flight to excellence and what that means and how we all support our learners and to get them to that end goal, which for us is to have those dispositions and knowledge that they can move forward and do whatever they want and never be held back by something that they don't have the ability to do. So that's kind of the working definition of our improvement process, and we've been using that and refining it for years. This is just some examples of, especially in the last month or so. I think all of these happened in the last month. And we're in Kenosha News or West of the Eye, and basically showing our students be incredibly successful in some of these outside of school, but yet school-related endeavors. So I just wanted to kind of show some of these. I'm not going to talk specifically to them, but they're bigger than the nuts and bolts of the school day. They have some of that project-based learning. They're competing against other students in different demographics. Future Cities, for example, those kids are going to come to our board meeting. They go to MSOE and they are able to have conversations with engineers about this work that they've created in a sustainable city and an environment. It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing. So those are at our board meeting. Those examples are going to be laid out so people can see them. It's truly taking learning to that next level. So the other piece of that, as we sit in this beautiful facility, is we're really thankful for the community support that we have. We would not be able to do the things that we do without a great Board of Education, a great community support that rallies around our kids and gets them ready for that next step. So, thank you for supporting what we do here, because we would not literally be able to do that without all that support. This facility is amazing. We've been able to show it off in the last 3 or 4 months as a volleyball tournament has come here, a basketball tournament, and people are just in awe. It's a great place to learn and grow. So, but there are challenges, especially in the fiscal environment. We're going to talk about some of the things where we've had success, but early on, Wheatland had some challenges. Districts in Wisconsin, when they have a need for revenue limit relief, and Wheatland was one of those very early districts based on way back when the revenue limit was put into place back in 1992, the lower spending districts really struggled later on because that was a fixed capped number. So Wheatland kind of had that perfect storm of declining enrollment, revenue limit that was fixed and capped, and dropping state aid, because as you lose students, your state aid drops as well. So that's a perfect storm that a lot of districts have been facing. Wheatland was one of the first to have to attempt a referendum, an operating referendum, especially in this area. The other piece of it was open enrollment. We were upside down in open enrollment. We were losing kids to other school districts. And we didn't have many open enrollment students coming here. And so that was not a good balance as well. Obviously, like in any business, costs increase every year, the majority of our costs, because we're when I talked about the staff, we're a staff-based kind of industry, so our teachers' salaries, benefits, all those things, that's what drives the majority of our budget. And in a year like this, where you've got a lot of inflation, that's a real piece that we have to deal with. And then, obviously, the only way to really increase that revenue limit is through a referendum, or getting a bunch of resident students to move in. So that's kind of the overall plan, which I'll speak to in a minute. But evidently, because there are so many districts that are going out to referendum, I mean, the funding system is broken in Wisconsin. Without additional revenue limit relief, it's about 50% of the schools in the state have to do that and go out to referendum. So unless your population's growing, your resident population, which very few in Wisconsin are, just based on the demographics, and people are having fewer children, that there are only a few districts in the state that are really able to continue on and have revenue limit changes. So also we reduced the amount to the revenue limit calculation, so there's been no additional money in the revenue limit calculation for since 2015. So they, in the biennial budgets, they put money towards aid, but not towards revenue limit relief. So that makes things a little bit more complicated as well. So I just gave a number. I mean, I looked up on DPI. Since 2017, they're well over around 340, over that now, I'm sure, as April comes, that have had districts that have had to go to referendum for operating expenses. And so the background of that is ours expires at the end of this year. So essentially, it was a 4-year referendum, operating referendum, and expired. So this is kind of our history of the referendums that have passed here in Wheatland. So back in 2005, there was an ask of the community, and that's when it started. It actually started quite a few years before that, but they did not pass here. And then as it moved, progressed towards present day, and that last one is the current number that we're looking at. So if you notice, the one that's expiring, that was done in April 2018, was for $625,000 per year. The one that we're asking for at this time is a reduction of $100,000 a year, and that really doesn't happen. And I couldn't find an example of where that's happened in the state because, as I said before, costs accelerate. Generally, the referendum amount has to increase as well. So just a quick explanation. There are other ways that the district could confront this issue, and one of them is for instead of a non-recurring referendum, which has a fixed time, in this case of 4 years, they could go have a recurring referendum that would go on to infinity, essentially. So the district has decided not to do that for several reasons. One is because we don't know what the next biennial budget will look like in Madison, and we don't know what the support will be in that But also, if you look at, from a taxpayer's perspective, I think that's a little bit difficult because, as I said, there's cost increase as you go over time. You don't want to layer a referendum on top of a referendum on top of a referendum. So I think while it's more work, obviously, to come back at this every 4 years and explain the cycle, that's what the board has decided to do to kind of keep that as it has been in the past and go for 4 years. It also allows for some flexibility as changes kind of happen in the district, as we add additional students or something happens that you don't want to be locked in for that length of time. So this is obviously the need comes down to that the referendum is ending. So if we don't have an additional referendum or continue the current one that we have, that ability to levy for those dollars will drop off. So next year we would not be able to do that. So here's the actual wording of it. Like I said, it's 4 years, $525,000. Essentially, it's moving the previous one forward, but reducing it by $100,000 a year or $400,000 total. So this is just part of that process that happened back in October. The district knew. In fact, I've been thinking about this. This is my 9th year here. I've been thinking about this for 4 years because I knew that when this sunsets, that's that next process, that we have to go through this. So it's been on my mind for sure, and the board's too. So one of the things that, through the wisdom of the board, that was decided over time is that how do you make a district like Wheatland here work, okay? Because we didn't have an increasing resident population. In fact, we had people open enrolling out like crazy. So how do you make that work? Well, one of the ways is through increasing open enrollment. Having a great product where you attract other students from the area to fill in those gaps within your school. And so that was one of the pieces. The second piece is decreasing that open enrollment out, right? So, and that's a tough thing to do because it's kind of a generational piece. Most parents who have their child come to a school, if they have siblings, they're going to want all their kids at the same school, right? So in order to do that, you've got to flip that whole family, and so it's really tough to do. It takes, in some cases, decades. We have had some success with that as well. And then finally, families moving to Wheatland because of the schools. And I think there was a time when people were like, I don't know if that's going to happen, but we definitely have that. We hear that. If you look at the real estate market, they'll say Wheatland schools. It increases their property values. It's a bonus. It's a phenomenal opportunity for the kids in this area, and you'll see why. Obviously, in a minute, when we start talking about open enrollment here, and one of the things that's allowed us to do what we've been able to do over the last decade, it's through that process. So here's the things over the course of the decade that have happened. All right, increased enrollment from just over 400, and the year before that it was under 400 to about 585. Okay, that's a huge increase. Increased open enrollment from 56 to 192. That's the current numbers. The third Friday numbers. Decreased open enrollment out. So that number continues to come down. Like I said, that's a difficult number. Plus, we have a 30 square mile. Our district is 30 square miles. So if you are at the edge, you might be way closer to another district than you are to Wheatland. And then expanding programming, obviously I talked a little bit about that. Improving the facilities here. I don't think anyone could argue with how great of a facility it is now. And a big piece of what makes Wheatland special, as I said before, is the staff. And we've been able to retain and attract the very best in the area. The very best in the area. And that only happens because they buy into the mission and are part of the growth that we've been able to accomplish. So Wheatland, I don't think there's an argument that it hasn't become a destination district. And we have students coming from over 400 square miles. So if you think about Kenosha, Racine, Burlington, Lake Geneva, that's a big area. We have parents that drive their kids 35, 40 minutes to come to school here. So this is kind of the what that looks like numbers-wise. If you look, the open enrollment increase, I talked about those numbers. This is just kind of shows you longitudinally what that's looked like over time. So in the last 4 years, like I said, we were talking about that improvement process. There's been a lot of good things that have happened in the last 4 years as well. So within that time, early on, in order to help with some of the facility improvements that needed to happen, some carpet issues, classroom issues, Wheatland took out a loan of about $500,000 in a QZAB process. This was prior to my time here, and that would have come due, I think, in 2024. We were able to pay that off several years early, which decreased the interest that we had to pay. So that was a positive. The district has not used the full levy authority that it was granted by the previous referendum in 2 of the 4 years. So if a referendum passes and we add $625,000 per year to the revenue limit each year, then you're able to levy, you have the levy authority to be able to do that, okay? So in 2 of those years, the board decided we don't want to raise the levy. We want to keep the levy flat or reduce it slightly, so we're not going to use the full levy authority. And it's a pretty substantial amount. So in year 2 of the last referendum, it was by $210,000. They left $210,000 on the table, which you can't get back. I mean, that was previously approved, but they didn't use those dollars. And the year after that, left $151 on the table. And there aren't many, if any, districts in the state that have been able to do that either. So the reason I know that is because DPI calls us and says, do you realize that you are not using your full revenue limit authority as we go through that process? And we're like, yeah, we know what we're doing. And the board in its wisdom is keeping that levy flat. So I will show you what that looks like in a minute. School districts do not get all their money at once. Okay, they get it throughout the year. The dollars from taxpayers comes, partially right away in January, and then a little bit in February. The money from the state comes sometime in the summer. But we have our obligations every month of the year, so we have to pay our staff. So a lot of districts who do not have a fund balance actually have to take out a loan, and it can be a pretty substantial loan. At one time, way back, we borrowed over $2 million for the year in order to pay our people. Because we just don't get that money in the way that works for us. We were able to eliminate that. So if you can think about borrowing money, which we all have done, there's a cost to that, right? There's interest involved in that. So we've been able to eliminate those costs as well, which can be as much as $20,000 a year. So that goes to kids instead of to a bank. We've been able to make additional contributions to Fund 39. Which is our debt service. So the building that you're sitting in right now, there was a facilities referendum 4 years ago at the same time of the last operating referendum, and during that time there was the taxpayers approved that referendum, which did all these great things for the school. Well, we pay that off every year to the tune of about between $500,000 and $600,000. It depends on the interest rate and how it is every year. That we were able to put away additional monies, so at the end of that, we're not going to have it's not going to be a 20-year loan. We already have dollars set aside to be able to pay off some of that debt early, so that's a positive. Obviously, creating a facility fund. One of the reasons that districts go to referendum is because the dollar amount that they need in order to fix the boilers or do something within the building is more than they have in their operating budget for the year. Those dollars are already accounted for. So sometimes, for a facility improvement, they go referendum for that, like we did. Our goal is for the smaller items, and I don't mean small items because obviously we have those within our budget, but I'm saying like a boiler. Or recently, a good example would be the roof. The roof blew off this past winter in a really windy day, and so we have to replace the roof. Well, that's $200,000. In most times you would not have those dollars. We were able to put away some of those dollars in a fund in order to pay for that. And so we have dollars ready for some of those things that might occur. So we won't have to go to referendum for those kind of things. And then dramatically reduce the mill rate. And mill rate is a function of your property value, so we don't have a lot of control over that, but I will say that a lot of districts kind of focus their conversations around mill rate. We focus ours, at least we have in the last decade, around levy. And there's a difference, which I'll show you again. And then the other piece of it is, in 7 of the last 8 years, the actual levy, so what you pay on your home in taxes, or your property in taxes, actually has been reduced in 7 of the last 8 years. The only year that it wasn't was the one I talked about 4 years ago when there was a referendum to approve the facilities improvements. That's the only one. So the 4 areas that make up school funding for most districts are, and I'll just talk about the first two first, or the first and the third. Local sources, which those are your taxes, okay? State sources, which is aid from the state. And then we have an additional category, and most do, but ours is pretty substantial because of our open enrollment growth. That's 20% of our yearly revenue. So, and then federal sources are just a very small part of that. So that's kind of what makes up the overall revenue that we see in a school district. I want to just show you a little bit of the tax levy history. So what I was talking about before, 2021 is on the right hand side in the blue, and 2018-19 is in the yellow. That is the actual tax levy that has been approved by the board, that has gone out, and that's where your taxes are based on. That's decreased every year since the last referendum. So that just shows, kind of illustrates what I was talking about, the facility referendum 2018-19. But previous to that, there was a decrease year over year in every year. So mill rate, I talked a little bit about mill rate. Again, that's a function of your property and what that's assessed at. So 4 years ago, the mill rate here was 8.66. This current year was 6.83. So as property values have increased, obviously the mill rate will go down, but your taxes still could go up depending on how your home is assessed. But the levy piece is what we're kind of focusing on. But I wanted to just show you the mill rate. So here's a lot of districts around us, and kind of show you is just a 2-year comparison. If you look at, Wheatland is on the top, the 2019-20 mill rate is here, and then the 2020-21, so a year later, it kind of shows you the difference, the drop that I was talking about. Same thing for the levy. The levy dropping over here, it shows you how much it decreased, and it kind of goes and breaks down every other district. Very few in this environment have been able to keep the levy flat or decrease it. That's something that Wheatland's been able to do, and I think it's a good story to tell. And just a comparison down the road, Randall's more of a mill rate district, and so over the course of the last 6-7 years, the mill rate at Wheatland has decreased by 2.6, where at Randall it's basically remained flat in the same environment with property values increasing. So here's what we call the Baird model. So this breaks down all of our revenues, all of our expenditures, puts in a future forecasting. It's done by a company that we work with, Baird, and so it kind of pushes out like what it would look like for us without a referendum. Obviously, there's a lot of red there. So if you're dropping $625,000 off of your ability to increase your revenue, we'd be $430,000 in the hole next year. Okay, and that would increase by cost of living, cost of staffing, all of that. So in a very short period of time, we'd be essentially insolvent, right? You can't continue to move forward as a district like that. That's where we were 10 years ago, and we were having to make some decisions about is this district able to be successful? Obviously we've proven, yeah, it can be at a really high level, but we can be back in that same spot in a big hurry if we don't have a referendum. So here's what it looks like with a referendum. Now, obviously, it's a pretty conservative model, so there's still red there, but we don't know what the state's going to do. They're going to have to do something different. This year, there was no additional dollars put into school funding and into the formula, so the federal dollars that were given to school districts were used in the same capacity as local dollar, or as state dollars would be this during this biennium. But school districts aren't going to be able to survive like that. So there has to be new money in schools in the next biennium. So we're assuming, we don't have that in here, or it's not in this model. So the other piece of it is that obviously our costs increase over time. So there are a lot of ways you could do a referendum. You could have it go up by $200,000 or whatever your costs are going to increase every year. I think that's confusing, and it looks like it's, the costs are increasing and it's never ending. So in this case, when you have a flat operational referendum, you might not need all those dollars in that first year, but you're going to need more than that in the fourth year, just as things change. So I don't know if that, hopefully that makes sense. So I gave you a lot. I mean, school funding is a really complicated piece. I try to make it as simple as possible. In the end, I think it comes down to, do you think we're doing a good job with the tax dollars and the outcomes that we're having for kids? I mean, ultimately, that's what it's about. I think, having the information is really important. And we're going to have another one of these, and get information out as much as possible. But this is not the first time we're doing this, and it won't be the last. There is no, unless things change in the school funding formula, there is no conceivable future without a referendum here. It just doesn't work. It doesn't mean we're spending more money. It just means that we can't, our revenue limit is substantially below what we even currently spend. Questions?
How's the revenue limit set?
Well, the revenue limit was set a long time ago, and there was something that's kind of referred to as the three-legged stool, in school funding. So the revenue limit was created after the 1980s because they wanted to put a limit on how much was spent. School districts could really levy for whatever they wanted to. And so when that was set arbitrarily at the number back in 1992, that stayed there. For the first decade or more, excuse me, those dollars increased every year. You got more per student added onto the revenue limit. In the last 6-7 years, that hasn't changed at all. So it's even compounded that problem. That's why so many districts have to do this. You'll notice, I'm not going to name districts around here, but pretty much everybody, all the K-8s in our local area, are either have a current referendum or are seeking a referendum in this April, or did not pass a referendum in the fall. And that's a scary, scary thing. There's nothing scarier when I first got here to think, well, is there going to be a district here? And when the first referendum, when it wasn't passed, we had to make some really big cuts. There's no other way to do that. And so I think we cut close to $200,000 in staffing. That's people's jobs, that's teachers in the classroom. That's a really difficult thing for a community. A really difficult thing. Because you can't get those dollars any other way. There's no way. You can't say, oh, we're not having sports. Well, those don't cost very much, right? Our uniforms, we make the best out of those. There's no other way to reach those that level of dollars.
You talk about should it not pass, or it hasn't passed at other schools. If it doesn't, would you have to wait the 4 years again to do another referendum, or do you wait the next year? How does that work?
Yeah, so you can, I want to get this right, so Wendy might need to help me, because they've changed it. It used to be that you could have as many referendums as you wanted, you just keep trying to pass it. But that has changed. So I think it's yearly. If you were to fail a referendum, you would have to wait that following April, is I think right?
I think you can do 2 in a year.
2 in a year? Okay. Yeah. So if the previous one, when we had 2 in the same election cycle, so we had 2 in April, then you would have to wait an entire year. So I think we could go back in November. But the problem with that is that by November, we have to have our levy, decided. So we have to do a lot of backtracking in order to do that. So yes, you don't have to wait 4 years, but I think it's a calendar year, you can have 2 within a calendar year.
Do you have a plan together of what happens if it doesn't pass?
Sure, always. What would happen is we would be spending that fund balance that we talked about. So right now, our fund balance is just over 30% of our Fund 10 revenue. So that allows us to then use those dollars, but then as that ticks down and as interest rates go up, that $20,000, there are districts that were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to borrow money to run the district, So, yeah, we're not gonna close the doors. We have a great financial setup, the board has seen to that. Yeah, we'd have to figure things out. I mean, it definitely would not be laying off staff in that first year. We're in better shape than that, but other districts aren't. I mean, some districts don't have a fund balance, or have a 6% fund balance. And so they're in a different situation.
Speaking to that fund, is that still the balance of what you took out in like the $500,000 before, or is that just the overture because you've actually paid that off?
Correct,
Okay.
yeah, so it's the dollars that we've been able to kind of put away, like, at the end of the year, I mean, I showed you that open enrollment revenue. There's a difference of, we were paying out about $450,000 10 years ago. We are taking in over $1 million now. So that is where that money comes from, because as we've been able to grow, like in a year where we don't know how many kids are gonna come, so you set your budget, and then in the fall, you get a certain amount of kids. Now we've throttled that down a little bit, we don't allow, in some classes, we close that, close certain classes due to class size, things like that. But in the early days, we could take pretty much anybody, and those dollars then would go to, a lot of times, the fund balance. So we went from a negative fund balance. So we in the first year, we did not have a fund balance. We actually were about $300,000 in the hole. We built that up over time to what it is currently.
Okay, follow up. So it sounds like a lot of our money, and based on your presentation, a lot comes from open enrollment, which obviously is doing really well. How much more room for growth do we have in that before we are capped and can't take, I mean, it looked like we grew by 180 students or something. When is too many?
Yeah, well, there are some grades currently that are too many. So 6th grade going into 7th is closed next year. We have certain, previous to last year, which last year we hired 6 teachers. Okay, so we hired and it wasn't because of open enrollment. Basically, a month before school started, we're like, oh my gosh, we've got our own kids, we've got kids coming back because things are going well, and we have the open enrollment we counted on. So it was kind of that tipping point, right? Like, we don't want 28 kids in a 2nd grade classroom, so we have to have 3 sections. So when we first started this, we only had 1 section that was 3 sections from the whole school. Now, every grade level is 3 sections. So we still have, Chris has always been trying to figure this out, but I mean, we probably 60 more kids. And the other piece is that open enrollment dollars, that changes in each biennium too. So you get additional dollars. That hasn't been a flat number since it started at about, I don't know, $7,800-ish, and has gone up to almost 9,000. So that has gone, based on inflation too. So at some point, yeah, there is going to be that nexus, right, where this would cost money. It might be in 4 years, it might be in 8 years, it might be in 12 years. I don't know. But that's a great question. Any other questions? Well, thank you. I know it's a really beautiful night, and thanks for those that came out. I appreciate it. At any time, anyone can call and reach out to me. I'm glad to explain any facet of that, get any numbers that are needed. We really appreciate the community support. It could not be, we could not be more proud of the district and what and how it is perceived in the community, because things have changed over time, and it's a great place. When you walk around the halls here to see what happens and see the great things that students and teachers do, it's an amazing place to be. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.